Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 12th of August 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening, and thank you very much for spending some of your Tuesday evening with us. Tonight it's just myself, and I'm going to spend some specific quality time with you talking about some of the latest data that we've been looking at. I actually called this show the Households Under the Pump Make It Stop. That was actually a comment that I got from one of my recent one-to-one conversations with a household that was really struggling and saying, we don't understand how this can possibly get better. We really feel that we're running really hard but getting nowhere. How do we make it stop? So I thought that would be a good, hopefully, attention-grabbing title for the show tonight. So that's what we're going to talk about. And as normal, what we're going to do is break the show into three pieces. Firstly, we're going to look at some of the latest economic data, the RBA information, and some other things. In the second part of the show, I'm going to go through the top-level analysis from the latest stress surveys that we've done. And in the third part of the show, we're going to look at some of the specific postcode information. I've already got a couple of postcodes that people asked for before the show. They'll be in that third part, but there'll also be time if you'd like me to analyze particular postcodes. We can do that too. So that's the scheme of things for tonight. Just before I get started, let me remind you, as I always do, this isn't specific financial or legal or even property advice. It's a general conversation. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, suggestions in as we go. I won't necessarily follow everything that's going on. There's just too much in the chat. But if you have a specific question or you'd like a postcode, then if you use that Walk the World, that'll get into my queue, and that enables me then to see what's going on and hopefully get those comments into the conversation. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question to the top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always really appreciate those who support us via the Super Chat program or via Patreon or via the other mechanisms, including PayPal. Details below. And as always, we don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really, really important conversation about it, particularly at the moment. So in tonight's show, what we're going to do is start by looking at the RBA's decision and what it means. And then we'll go on to look at some of the other information that's been shared recently. And from there, what we're going to do is look at the information from my surveys. But on the way in, let me just remind you of this data which came out today. So firstly, Roy Morgan highlighted that the unemployment and underemployment rate, according to their definition of unemployment, is sitting at 21.2% and it's going up. Compare that with the ABS definition at 10.3%. So there's something rather worryingly wrong with the difference between the two. And as we will see, some of this relates specifically to definitions. Not least, how do you define unemployed? But it's the underemployed which I want to highlight, because in my surveys, what I'm seeing is that there are more and more households who are struggling to get the additional hours that they wanted to get to enable them to keep their heads above water. So that's quite concerning. The second piece of information from, again, Roy Morgan, this time an ANZ, related specifically to the latest Household Confidence Consumer Index. And here it fell a bit, 1.3 points lower, but they do make the point that it's risen slightly. But just to stress that compared with the long-term average at around 110, we're down in the mire still. And there's a long way to go before we get back to anything like reasonable confidence levels. But again, I'd also highlight that it's spread quite significantly across different household groups. So some are doing okay if they don't have a mortgage, if they don't have to pay rent, if they've got lots of assets on the stock market, they're probably doing okay and confidence levels are quite high. Others, less so. So an aggregate number like this tells you something, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that much. So let's move on now to talk about the RBA. Of course, the RBA today cut the cash rate, as expected, sort of, by 25 basis points to 3.6%. I noted the ABC, when they put the thing up initially, said 3.65 and had to make a correction. That was quite amusing. They said inflation has fallen substantially. The headline inflation has been affected by the temporary cost of living relief measures, and at 2.1%, of course, that's lower than the real number. They are forecasting that the underlying inflation will continue to moderate to around the midpoint of 2 to 3% range, with the cash rate assumed to follow a gradual easing path. So a little bit more later. Of course, timing is the question. Interestingly, they highlighted again uncertainty in the world economy. Real household incomes have picked up a little, although, of course, this is not uniformly spread, as we'll see in my analysis. Nevertheless, labour market conditions remain tight. Unemployment rate at 4.3%, an average 4.2% in the June quarter as a whole. The utilisation remains at low rates, and the underutilisation, say, remains at low rates, and business surveys and liaisons suggest the available labour is still a constraint for a range of employers. Well, that's a bit at odds with what Roy Morgan highlighted with the underutilisation. So there's something weird there. The quarterly volatility is also a concern, but looking through that, wages growth have eased and productivity growth has not picked up. And as we'll see, they had to make some assumptions about future productivity to the downside, which is quite interesting. They also then highlight again uncertainties about the domestic economic activity and also the international developments. They said there's a risk that consumption growth is a little slower than expected. Alternatively, real income and wealth could rise, and that means households could consume more, and that could actually lead to potentially higher inflation. And there's also uncertainties about the lags effect in terms of when monetary policy happens and how firms' pricing decisions and wages will respond. And they specifically made the point, actually, quite interestingly, that some firms have seen higher input costs, but so far are eating those costs rather than actually transferring them into the price of goods to consumers, which implies potentially higher inflation down the track. We'll watch for that later. And I do think this uncertainty question and the lag between pulling the lever and seeing what happens is quite significant. Anyway, they did actually say, as a result of all this, that they judge further easing of monetary policy as appropriate. We've seen 75 basis points of easing, of course. They're cautious about the outlook, heightened levels of uncertainty. They'll be attentive to the data and the evolving assessment of the risks, and they will continue to focus on price stability and full employment, and will do what it considers necessary to achieve that outcome. So that's where we are with the RBA. And as I'll show you in a second, I've got some questions about some of the information that they shared. But just as we go into that, I did actually put a poll up. And you might want to take the time just to answer the poll on the YouTube there. So today's poll: how will today's RBA rate cut impact you? And I gave you 4 different choices. Is it going to be a major help to my finances? Is it going to be a slight help to your finances? Is there no impact to your finances? Or will it actually reduce your income because of the lower rates on deposits? So feel free to throw your comments there in the poll, and at the end of the show, I'll share the results. Now, in response to the RBA, of course, we got this from the AFR. The RBA issues shock warning of a poorer Australia as it cuts rate. So they downgraded the long-term outlook for productivity growth and warned the economy is incapable of sustainably growing faster than 2% per year, in a grim reality check just 1 week before Treasurer Jim Chalmers' Economic Reform Roundtable. They said that the RBA is now looking at productivity at 0.7% over the medium term, down from the previous assumption of 1%. Now, be careful about this, because the way that they use the productivity, it's actually an assumption that they put in their models. So, as Michelle Bullock said during the press conference, they were looking at the inflation trends, the unemployment trends, etc., and trying to work out how to make the model work. And so they actually had to reduce the productivity assumption to be able to fit the indicators that they've currently got with the indicators that they want to see. So rather than actually specifically projecting future productivity, what they've done is just use a plug number. So in a way, what the Fin Review is doing here is putting a bit of a spin on that 0.7%, which is probably not really what it was designed to do. And in fact, Michelle Bullock said they do not specifically forecast productivity. So a bit of a black mark to the Fin Review for this article. Now, Shane Oliver did put this out. RBA forecasts slightly slower growth than in May, unemployment at 4.3% and inflation at target, predicted are predicated on further gradual rate cuts to 2.9%, and without the inflation be lower and unemployment higher. So we continue, he said, to expect 0.25% cuts in November, February, and May. So that's what he is highlighting. And, that's probably reasonable. I'll highlight there the trimmed mean inflation, 2.6, 2.6, 2.6, 2.6, 2.5 in 2027. And I do think there's still great uncertainty about the trajectory of the inflation number. And just on the productivity, this was from the AFR, just highlights just how bad things are. If you look back through the 2000 to 2010, productivity was actually significantly above where it is now. So Houston, we have a major problem. And as I discussed with Edwin yesterday, the roundtable next week is going to be a talk fest, but they seem to be excluding a lot of stuff, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, the other side of the equation is a question about what the costs are. And in fact, I made a show called Cost of Living Are Up, but How Much? And I actually went through the difference between the CPI analysis of costs, the cost of living indices, and the true costs as per my household surveys in terms of what people are actually paying. And the truth is that real inflation, lived inflation, the inflation that ordinary households are feeling, seem to me to be quite a lot higher, nearly double the official cost of living statistics, which includes, of course, the costs relating to mortgages and rents. And of course, that in turn is still quite a lot higher than the official CPI, which is bumbling around 2 to 2.5%. So we do have an issue with how much cost of living are still going up. And many people are finding that their money is just not going as far as previously. And there was this article, thanks to Cookie Boy for this, that shows how inflation has actually hit your hip pocket. And you can see there over the 4 years of inflation, eggs have gone way, way up, oils and fats, etc., etc. And this survey, which came out very recently from the Resolve Political Monitor, highlights the fact that people are still cutting back and buying carefully to try and get by. And of course, if you look here, here's the main stories. I thought this was fascinating from the NAB. Economists can say that things are improving, but until people actually feel a real tangible change, they don't listen to economists, which I think is spot on. I'm seeing that in my surveys and in my measure of household confidence. And just another quick snapshot here, of course, insurance costs are rising considerably. This is a little case study that was in a recent article that showed that back in 2023, the annual premium on the Gold Coast was just over 3,600 and something. It went up, and in 2025, it's gone up to 12,905. And certainly we do see insurance costs being one of those significant creeping levers that people are struggling with. And again, in my surveys, because I look at households in the round, I'm capturing all of their cost inputs. And as I say, my analysis is that costs are actually rising a lot higher than the official statistics. Now, is that because the official statistics are wrong? Or is it simply because they've actually made some assumptions which are inappropriate? I think it's a mixture of both. And as I discussed in that earlier show, go check it out if you want to see more detail. There's a couple of issues. One is the statistical information inputs into the ABS are quite wobbly at the moment. And they also have made some policy changes in terms of how they measure things. So the true real cost for many people is a whole lot higher. In terms of what's ahead, yes, I think we can expect probably a couple more rate cuts. And as we'll see in my sensitivity analysis through my scenarios, when those come will be quite important. But as this article earlier on highlighted, the rapid fire rate cut hopes probably are evaporating, and it's going to be lower and longer. And how far low it goes is the interesting question. This actually was quite fascinating from the Statement on Monetary Policy that came out today. They're expected to gradually decline to around 3.1% by early 2026. But remember, This is the market expectations which they plumb in to their models. It's not the Reserve Bank's expectations. Another little piece of information here. Lenders have passed on the May cash rate reduction, and it's also hit deposit rates, hence my question in the show there about the issue of whether in fact your income is going down because deposit rates are going down. I'd also make the point that private credit data for June was actually higher, annualized at 5.8 for owner occupied and 6.3% for investor. And that means that for many people, they're borrowing more relative to their income than previously. And another piece of evidence through the lending indicators, this is old data now, we'll get the latest lending indicators in a couple of weeks, or no, less than that now, actually, later on this week, I think. But you can see here the average loan for both occupier and for investor dwellings continues to rise. And that means that debt's still a problem for some households. And if you're in the rental sector, it's worth highlighting that the national vacancy rates, according to SQM, fell to 1.2%. It varies, but there's a problem. Australia's rental market tightened further in July, with the vacancy falling to 1.2%, down from 1.3% in both June and July 2024, according to the latest SQM research data. And just by way of comparison, if you hop across to Canada, they've reported, this is RBC Economics analysis, there's rents are now declining in half of Canada's 40 census metropolitan areas, and Vancouver leads the steepest year-on-year drop. Another way of showing it, you can see there that some quite significant falls in terms of dollar drops. Toronto is the only major market to see the rental burden shrink, they said. And guess what? Population growth slows, most in Ontario and BC, because of course they've dialed back migration substantially. And funny that, it's very interesting to note that when you dial back migration and reduce the demand for property, rentals drop. Whereas, of course, in Australia, we are continuing to pump migration and rents continue to rise. And the true CPI for rentals is much higher than the official CPI data in the ABS numbers. So that's another factor that I see in my data too. Now, as we take the conversation forward, of course, the budget is a problem. And as discussed with Urban yesterday, we are seeing funding cliffs ahead. And so the question is, what levers do you pull? And of course, there were various levers discussed ahead of the roundtable, including broaden the GST, or what about indexing income tax bands? Probably worth thinking about. What about productivity growth and how that hits or relates to company tax? Should that be looked at? And all these handouts from various sources, particularly the government in recent times, which is blowing the budget up. Is that really helping? But it's interesting that Albo has come out and said, no, we're not going to look at taxes. We're not going to do a whole lot of things. And it's interesting that this chart produced by Treasury highlights that a lot of the tax breaks on things like superannuation contributions and earnings and property and shares and particularly investment properties, guess what? It's the highest few percent that actually are benefiting. So that's a real problem in terms of quintiles. It's the highest that get the most out of it. So there's a big important conversation, but Albo has not backed the tax change ideas. And of course, Minister Claire O'Neill has said we're not going to do anything on negative gearing. And as Tarek Brooker said, the on-again, off-again debate about negative gearing has been settled for now, with Housing Minister Claire O'Neill ruling out any changes. So, unfortunately, I don't think this Talkfest next week is going to be that useful in terms of getting to any significant issues. Obviously, the NDIS is a big issue, and that's a big drain, but there are lots of other big drains. Corporate taxation is very much skewed. There are lots of corporates not paying their fair share of tax, but the tax on individual households are continuing to rise dramatically, and that's a real problem. And of course, we also have the global uncertainty with the tariffs and Trump's latest shenanigans, including now, of course, basically charging a couple of large firms to be able to sell their chips to China, which is amazing, 15% on those chips going to the US Treasury are remarkable. But as I think we should bear in mind, things like the 250% tariffs on medicines is a problem. They're talking about lifting the tariffs on India because of the secondary relationship between India buying oil from Russia. And as a result of all that, well, this chart rather well sums it up. Consumers in the US are going to get hit, but not in the short term, in the longer term. But there's also going to be broader fallout as well. And some of that fallout's going to come back to Australia. So one of the questions and the level of uncertainty that the RBA is wrestling with is the amount of uncertainty around the trade policies and what's going to happen. And we haven't seen the end of this evolution. And of course, we heard overnight that now the negotiations between the US and China have been extended for another 90 days as they continue to negotiate. And of course, Trump is meeting with Putin in Alaska on Friday. What will come of that? Who knows? But maybe won't necessarily be great for the local people in Ukraine. Anyway, let's just move the conversation forward because, of course, the latest press was all about auction numbers steady while prices are strong. There's just so many of these. Just note that, of course, the latest results show that the numbers sold were relatively low relative to reported, but that's not how they calculate, compared with listed. And if you did the compared to listed, then you get a very much lower clearance rate, but nobody wants to talk about that. There was also press coverage of the backlash over unit city plans, where they wanted, for example, to put another 30,000 properties on the market. And it's just amazing, really. We've also got this on potentially fast-tracking approvals in Victoria for smaller developments in some places. So that's going to be an issue. There's also this article showing that older people are having to share housing more than previously. You've also got this one here, which talks about the fact that there are high prices in good school catchment areas. And as the articles flood out, you've got this one where show that home prices have grown in parts of Melbourne, but many suburbs are still in trauma. And we'll see an example of a trauma suburb a bit later. There's also a very big rise on renovations and a blowout in tradie costs, not least because in some cases people are finding that they can't sell, so they have to renovate. But people, they say, are riding the homeowner Goldilocks market. Majority of homeowners are using falling interest rates to get ahead of their mortgage, in other words, not paying down or reducing their repayments. I'm seeing some that are, but some aren't. And it's interesting that the slow pace of rate cuts was translating to a gradual increase in prices, which is a great scenario for those already in the market, said AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver, but also acknowledged it was more difficult for people to get into the market, and it's making very, very difficult. It seems that we are in a Goldilocks zone, but it is a bit of an issue. And by the way, if you wanted to give an example of some of the things like Gold Coast, where the Japanese investors are piling back, they say, or in Brisbane, buying ahead of the pre-Olympics, or what about the Sunshine Coast? I mean, you can't make these articles up. There are more and more and more of them, which are saying, this is the living top lifestyle suburbs revealed, and they're affordable. Or West is city's best suburb score 2020 in future growth and lifestyle options, according to a new survey that's being popped up. Or Townsville, that's the way you should be buying. So it is, I'm afraid, more spruik from those in the journalistic, I put that in inverted commas, the journalistic profession through the property portals directly or indirectly. A lot of this is rubbish. A lot of this is partial truth. And yet, of course, a lot of people are buying it nevertheless. Now, I will also make the point that the Real Estate Institute of Victoria is lobbying for better information disclosure about reserves, which I thought was quite interesting. And that takes us to the other little topic to talk about before I get into my surveys, that, of course, we've got the underquoting reveal. Sydney revealed as the underquoting capital. Well, no surprise if you've been following this channel. Edwin and I have been talking about this for a long, long time. False hope in underquoting capital. Suburbs most misguided by underquoting sellers. And, the story just goes on and on and on. We know that underquoting is a big thing and people are being misled, both on the vendor perspective and also from the respective purchaser perspective. That's a big deal. And it does look as though Sydney is the epicenter, but it's also very much being hit elsewhere. And in fact, the articles just keep coming. Thousands wasted in nations underquoting capital. And this article where we reveal the truth about property auction guides, they're not really very helpful, as this one says. Now, of course, Marco says, well, it can be frustrating. It's the market. No. It's actually the culture. It's the culture of the real estate sector that's the problem here, as Adriel and I have been discussing. And of course, if you want to talk about culture, then we've got to talk about this particular one. Teflon Josh has his license suspended. Dummy bidding, underquoting, high pressure sales tactics, and producing false documentations for fair trading are among the allegations being levelled against one of Australia's highest earning real estate agents. And, rubbery figures take people down the garden path. Well, it's part of the cultural problem we have around real estate. And unfortunately, it's widespread across the country. But it is interesting to see a little bit of reporting now in the press about this stuff, which is a little bit unusual. But, the fact of the matter is that, like it or not, there are real issues in the real estate sector. And as I highlighted in the show with Edwin yesterday, it's also hitting rental increases too, because it's actually often agents who are catalyzing rental increases, even if the property investor hadn't really thought about it. Why? Because that increases the value of the rent roll and therefore the value of their business. So that's a little bit of an issue. Well, that gives you a bit of a flavour for some of the background stories. I guess what we should now do is move the conversation forward and talk specifically about my latest analysis. And for those who've not seen the show before, this is the core market model that we use. We survey households on a rolling basis, and we continue to get good data from 52,000 households that plugs into our modelling. We slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways, and we also form a view about where prices may move based on scenarios that we'll talk about. And, just briefly, for those not seen it before, with mortgage stress data, the price trajectory data, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the CPI and economics, and the core market model together allows us to then form a view of where things may go. Oh, and I will just make my normal ad at this point. It is an ad. Shame, no shame at this end. I think it's important. If you're interested in a detailed conversation about a suburb, you can do that through the one-to-one service. This is an individual confidential discussion, and I can't give financial advice, but I can share my data at a granular level. I can look at the stress, the home price trend data, and also the modelling ahead and talk about what might be happening and some sensitivities around it. It's about an hour's conversation via Zoom or phone. There is a cost involved because there's a lot of work, about 6 to 8 hours work generally over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. And you can contact me via my blog if you'd like to set up a time for a conversation. I'm booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment, so it's quite busy. Now, in terms of the stress information, just to highlight again, I look in cash flow terms, money in, money out. You could talk about 30% of income or taxable income or something else, but I look at it through cash flow measures. And that means if you've got outgoings more than income, we exclude one-off discretionary items there. We define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, they're in rental stress. Investors with cash flow pressures are identified as stressed investors. And we can aggregate the data to estimate total financial stress. And we can look at it as percentage and count. And count is the better of the two because it gives you a sense of where the big issues are across the country. And we hold this definition and this analysis down at the postcode level for more than 2,000 something household postcodes. Now, just in terms of definition, this is the RBA chart from some time ago that showed that mild financial stress is budget pressures. It morphs through missing payments to insolvency. I'm measuring it at this mild end, at the budget pressure end. And that means that it doesn't automatically follow that people with financial stress, mortgage stress or rental stress, end up with missing payments or insolvency, but it's on the journey. And this journey often is actually 3 to 5 years, so it doesn't happen overnight. So here is the latest stress for July 2025 from our surveys. We'll start by looking at the rental stress. Now, rental stress has come off its highs just slightly. but it's still at 74.8% of households, which is still pretty high. And it's worth highlighting that, of course, we have seen some improvement in terms of basic wages growth at the bottom end, but we've also seen significant pressures from cost of living as well. So perhaps it's not surprising that many are finding their rent's an issue and therefore are in rental stress based on our definition. Mortgage stress is slightly down. 49.4% of households with a mortgage have cash flow pressures. It was above 50% a little while ago. So the lower interest rates on mortgages and the slightly higher income is helping, but the costs are still there significantly. Oh, and by the way, if you look at the debt to income ratio, which the RBA continues to sort of mess around with every month or every quarter when they publish the data, they would go back and restate the earlier data. But the ratio is 181 on their measure, but that, of course, is all households. If you divide it by 3, you get closer to 6. And we are still seeing some households with debt to income ratios in the 8 to 13% proportion range, which is horrible. Now, here is the data for July, and you can see there that overall mortgage stress dropped slightly, 49.4%. Rental stress dropped slightly to 74.8%. Investor stress rose slightly, and that's due to higher costs of management services from the real estate agents, as well as the fact that the pressure on managing the property is going higher with the costs of repairs and things going up as well. And overall financial stress was down. And across the states, I've highlighted in yellow where they moved up from last month. So across the NT, it's higher across the board. In South Australia, mortgage stress and rental stress and financial stress is a little higher. Tasmania was higher for mortgage stress and investor stress, although rental stress was back down slightly. And in Victoria, while mortgage stress dropped, rental stress was up and investor stress was up, but overall financial stress was down just a little. And in WA, mortgage stress was higher, the rest slightly down. So that's the way it works. But look at the total numbers. According to me, there are around 10 million households across the country now, and around 1.8 million are in mortgage stress, 2.3 million in rental stress, 500,000 with stressed investors, in other words, investment property is not performing, and overall financial stress, 4.6 million households out of 9. In other words, more than half are doing fine, but the other half not so much. Here is the data also by the segments, and this is just to highlight that you can see there that young growing families are at the top of the list still. Not surprised because, of course, they've got more recent mortgages, they're first-time buyers, they're leveraged up to the gills. But it's also true that battling urban are also up there as well. So people in the main urban centres and those on the disadvantaged fringe as well are up there. Looking at rental stress, you can see there that the multicultural establishment group, the first generation migrants, are at the top of the list at 83.5%. But we also see young affluents and young growing families and battling urban and disadvantaged fringe and mature stable all showing considerable stress. And this is the point about rental stress. It's broadly based now across many of our segments. Investor stress is higher amongst the exclusive professionals and the young affluents because, of course, they've got a higher share of multiple investment properties, many of which are not performing well. And overall, the aggregate financial stress shows that young growing families are at the top of the list, but there are quite a few other segments also being caught, those on the urban fringe, those closer in and those further out, but also some older households too. So it is a problem. And to my mind, this is a story that is not being adequately told in the mainstream, even now. Now we can look at the top postcodes. And this, of course, is looking at the count of households in mortgage stress. And postcode 2170 Liverpool is at the top of the list with 13,000 households in mortgage stress. That's 94%. We've also got Campbelltown in New South Wales with very high levels of stress. Then Toowoomba, 4350. Wanneroo in Western Australia with 11,000 households. Narre Warren in Victoria, Berwick and Harkaway, in Victoria and Pakenham in Victoria, all high growth corridors and all exhibiting high levels of mortgage stress. Then Riverston in New South Wales, Camden in New South Wales, Ballarat in regional Victoria, and then Murruwa in Western Australia, Roxburgh Park in Victoria, and Tarneet and Hoppers Crossing in Victoria there as well. Now, the risk of default is my estimate over the next 12 months as to the potential number of households that, with a mortgage, are likely to end up in a default state. And Cranbourne is the highest, followed by Mandurah and Success and Armidale in Western Australia. Now, it's interesting, these Western Australian postcodes are actually still suffering from the excesses of some years ago. So it shows you that it takes a long time for this to work through. The Roxburgh Park, Tarneit and Derrimut is more about the more recent changes, and we do see some pressure there. And then places like Toowoomba, Wanneroo, Bundaberg, again in Queensland, and Gosford up in the mid-north coast is also, central coast I should say, is also showing signs. Quite a few people moved out to Gosford and surrounding areas post-COVID and through COVID, and in some cases they still have very large mortgages. Looking at the rental stress, you can see there that Melbourne has the highest count, 15,000, then Toowoomba, then Liverpool, then Southport, then Tarneit, Derrimut. Again, it's interesting how these same postcodes 2039 and 2030 pop up. Then we go to Westmead in New South Wales, Zetland and Waterloo showing up there, Yatala, Coomera, and then Mount Druitt in New South Wales and Ipswich in Queensland are all showing high counts of rental stress. And these percentages are all pretty high too. Remember, this is financial pressure. It doesn't mean that people are going to default or will have to stop paying. What it means is they have to prioritize, put more on credit cards, potentially cut back on other consumption. Stressed investors are also there too. It's interesting that now in the Tasmanian story is quite high. There's something weird going on there. Not sure. It's small counts, so you wonder, but there is a bit of an issue. Also, Bull Creek in WA, Cranbourne, Toowoomba, Bundaberg, Hornsby, Campbelltown, Naremburn, Wembley in Western Australia, DY in New South Wales, and Croydon Park in New South Wales are all showing high signs of stressed investors. And the stressed investors are, of course, people who potentially may have to sell their property because the cash flows don't work, the management fees are continuing to rise, and whilst there's some headroom to put rents up in some areas, I suspect the reason that there's an issue with Tasmania is that there is no capacity to put the rents up because households more generally are just underwater. So now if we go to our scenarios, this is quite important to understand as we take us to the next part of the conversation. Here, we're looking at not predictions, we're looking at sensitivities in the way the modelling works. I have three scenarios. The first one is called the Goldilocks zone. And my scenario now there was another rate cut in October to December to 3.35%, probably more next year. Inflation eases in line with the RBA expectations. We see wages rising faster than inflation. We don't get a recession, and migration remains above average. So that's the first scenario. The second scenario is what I call a soft landing. So we see rates sticking around 3.6% until December. We don't get inflation falls, but we do later get rises again. And that's really as the trade issues bleed through. And actually, inflation stays above target through 2026. And we don't get a recession, but we see lower levels of migration. And the third is the worst, the nightmare scenario, where we see rates hanging around 3.6 into 2026, but inflation steps up, unemployment rises, wages growth starts to stall due to the second order trade-led recession, and as a result, we do see some further rate cuts later, but it's too late. Migration drops below average. And that just gives you a bit of a flavour of the way we do our modelling. And that allows us then to look at the way that the specific work that we do takes us, because we can look at the sensitivities and we can compare the different analyses that we do. So if I then switch across and go to the stress analysis, which is this one here. Just 1 second. Just do that transition first. Right. So this is actually the stress analysis for the postcode 2500, which is, of course, Wollongong, which is the one that I look at on a regular basis. And the beauty of this, it just shows you the way that the model works in practice, because, of course, the model is essentially an output for all the things I've done. And what we have in the model is we have the household count. We have it split by the type of household. Are they owning outright? Are they borrowing? Are they renting? And also the investing count as well. We also have the stress data, so how many and what proportion are in mortgage stress, rental stress. If it's high, it's highlighted. Stressed investors and overall the financial stress, which is the aggregate. Now that financial stress flows through into looking at the sensitivity in terms of prices ahead. We also have the household count in terms of how many households are living in houses, what proportion are living in units and other types of property. We also have a people ratio, which is 1, 2, 3. If it's 3, it's families. If it's 2, it's couples. If it's 1, it's single. And of course, it won't be rounded necessarily. The vacancy rate based on the census. Of course, the census is getting old now. The next one is next year. So it'll be interesting to see whether they run the census next year. And will they actually provide census forms to those living in tents, I ask myself. The gross investment yield is 3.3 on this one. Net investment yield is minus 1.3. The difference between gross investment yield, where we're looking at the theoretical rental yield versus the price, which is the one, of course, all the agents quote all the time. Net investment yield is the true rental return after all the costs of managing the property and the interest that you pay on the property. And that's the real important one. And this one here, it's quite negative, of course. We also have the taxable data from the census and also from the ATO. The ATO data is more recent. It's the tax year 22-23, which was released very recently. We can then calculate the disposal monthly income, which will then give you the average per household. This is after tax, and the proportion going on the mortgage and the amount of that mortgage, and also the percentage going on the rental and the rent paid. And then finally, looking at our scenarios, we have the 3 scenarios where we look, cumulative speaking, what happens ahead with the 12 months, 24 months, and 36 months view of what's going on ahead. And the base and the worst case scenarios show you that in this particular one, well, if things go well, prices can rise further. The base case is a small fall and the worst case a more significant fall. So that's the way the model works. And that means that we can look at the story at that granular level. And that granular level is actually quite important in my view. Now, before I started the show, I checked my comments and there were a couple of people who'd actually asked specifically for analysis. So the first one, Steve asked for analysis on postcode 5290. So if I put 5290 and bring that up, you can see that it's Mount Gambier. And so in the postcode of Mount Gambier, there are 11,300 households, 31% own outright, 35% are borrowing, and 33% are renting. We have 35% of households in mortgage stress, 1,400. We have 45% in rental stress, 1,700. Not much stressed investor, and the households in financial stress overall at 29%. 76% of houses, a small number of units and types of property. People ratio is just 2, and the vacancy rate was 9.9% at the census. Gross investment yield is 4%, but the net investment yield is minus 0.4%. The average taxable, 73,000 from the ATO versus 62,000 from the household census. That gives a disposal monthly of around $4,500, with 29.1% going on the typical mortgage at $1,300 and 24.6% at $1,096 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, the best case scenario is still a quite significant rise ahead, Base case, a small rise, cumulative 5% over 3 years. The worst case, a potential fall. Now, interestingly, the other thing that we can do with this particular analysis is also to look at the price moves. When I've had notice, I can actually look at the price. So back in 2016, this Mount Gambier was at 230,000 median. In 2025, 503,000. So quite significant. And I find it fascinating that we've seen significant rises in South Australia, and Mount Gambier, of course, included. So that's the story there. Now, we had another request for this particular postcode, and that was postcode 3073. And this is Reservoir in Victoria. And I can tell you that the profile of this property area, as you'll see later, is quite different. So 21,000 households in this particular postcode. We have 31% earning outright, 31% borrowing, 36% renting. We have 71% in mortgage stress, 67% in rental stress. We have some stressed investors too, overall financial stress at 51%. We have 63% houses. We have a small number of units and other types of property. And the overall vacancy rate was 8.8%. People ratio is 2.17%. Gross investment yield is 3.2%. Net investment yield negative 1.3%. So investors are underwater. Average taxable, $83,000. The household census was $80,000. That gives a disposal monthly of $5,900, with 40% going on the typical mortgage, $2,383, and 30%, $1,974, going on the typical rent. And you can see here the scenarios are, well, in the very best case scenario, maybe a 1.4% cumulative rise over 3 years is what I'm seeing. The base case, a fall of 13%, and the worst case, a fall of 34% if things went really bad. And if we then look at the same modeling, we can also compare the price movements. And it's quite interesting to compare Reservoir with the other one we looked at. So back in June 2016, the median price was $670,000. It jumped up about 20% in 2017. It was flat in 2018. It went down in 2019 by well over 5%. It went up in 20, but a significant rise of 20% in 2021. It then fell in 2022 and 2023. It rose very slightly in 2024, but dropped again in 2025 to June 2025. So the median is 917,000. And this trend from the high peak back in 2021 to 2025 is actually replicated in a number of postcodes that I'm seeing in and around the Melbourne area. So one of the really interesting points to highlight in that 2 slides that we showed you, the massive difference between different locations. And if you want more on that, go and check out my anti-spook videos where I've shown how, for example, prices up in far north Queensland have been moving up quite significantly, whereas down on the south coast around Eden, prices have actually slid quite a lot. So it shows you that the movements are quite significant and different. So that gives you a bit of a flavor on that. Now, what I'm going to do is to cross back to the chat. And if you feel that there are postcodes you'd like me to analyze, I can't show you the price trends because my modeling is not instant enough to do that, but I can show you the one-page analysis. But I'll also look at some of the other questions potentially that you might have thrown at me. Austrader asks a postcode 4740. Right, 4740 is Mount Pleasant and Mackay. Here, 33,000 households, 27% owning outright, 39% are actually borrowing, and 32.4% are renting. Borrowers in mortgage stress are 44%, renters in rental stress 41%, stressed investors at 10%, households in financial stress 33.5%, 81% of houses, And you can see there the people ratio shows families. Quite high vacancy rates. It could be Airbnb and other types of temporary accommodation, second homes. Gross investment yield is 4.1. Net investment yield minus 0.4. Average taxable 97,000 from the ATO and 95,000 from the census. That gives a disposable monthly on average of around $6,600, with 31.5% going on the typical mortgage, just over $2,000, and 25.6%, $1,694 going on the typical rent. And that's giving us also some potential upside. So in the best case scenario, further rises ahead, maybe cumulatively 18% over 3 years. The base case is a 4% rise over 3 years. And the worst case, a bit of a fall, maybe 16% over 3 years. So Bossman asked for postcode 4519 and also 4510. Let's put 4519 up first. So this is Biwa in Brisbane and Moreton, 3,565 households, 32.7% owning outright, 43% borrowing, 24% are renting. Borrowers in mortgage stress, 23.6%. Renters in rental stress, 75%. And overall financial stress, not that high, 33%, with small amount of investor stress. 88% of houses in this area. People ratio is 2.52%. Vacancy rate was 5.7% at the time of the last census. Gross investment yield is 4.4%. Net investment yield is just flat. Average taxable, according to the ATO, 80,400 and 79,700 from the census data. Translates to a disposable monthly income around $5,300, with 38.6% or just over $2,000 going on the typical mortgage and 36.1%, 1,944 going on the typical rent. And from a scenario perspective, well, the best case still shows quite strong growth. The base case, a small rise, 1.5% over 3 years, and the worst case, a bit of a fall. Now, you also asked for 4510, so let's put that one in. $4510 is Caboolture. Here, 21,000 households, 26% owning outright, 36% of borrowing, 37% of renting. In mortgage stress, 14%. In rental stress, 87%. Stressed investors, 26%. Overall financial stress, 41%. 83% of houses. People ratio is quite high at 2.43%. Vacancy rate was 6.9%. Gross investment yield 4.4%. Net investment yield minus 0.2%. Average taxable 72,000 compared with the census at 68,000. That translates to a disposable monthly around 4,700, with 39.9% going on the typical mortgage and 33.9% going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, still further upside, 14% over 3 years. Best case, base case, pretty much nothing at all. And the worst case, a potential fall. Right, I'm just going to see what else is going on in the chat there, and any other questions that may not be postcode related. I always love it when people put in 2026. I don't know, is that a postcode or is that a year? Very good. Okay, let's have a look. What else have we got in the chat here? As I, yes, Boss Man from earlier on said the truth is, of course, that market time on the Sunshine Coast much higher. Yes, I agree. And Cookie Boy said that Teflon Josh had a 4-month suspension. That's interesting. What else have we got? Cookie Boy says a lot of regional areas are in trouble. Sellers are expecting higher than pandemic prices. Absolutely right. And in fact, I've got some data, of course, for Canberra, which we need to put up when we've got time. Drew said, oh dear, pack them. Comes in with a free machete. Very good, I'm afraid. Tassie is a royal mess. Yes, I agree with that. And Interesting question here. M2 increases 5.3%, but inflation is much lower. Well, of course, inflation is not measured accurately. This is my point from earlier on. And the asset boom that we're seeing is because of the high liquidity. M2 and M3 globally is higher than it's ever been. And that's just pumping asset prices, gold, Bitcoin, property, share prices ever higher. And of course, also, as property prices go higher, people can actually leverage up higher, which means the banks can expand their balance sheet, which means they can lend more. So remember also that inflation, as measured officially, excludes the cost of housing. They include building new houses, but not mortgage costs. So the big chunk of household costs that everybody gets hit with are not included. So that's why we have a massive issue there. So Timmy asked for 3049. Let's have a look. So this is West Meadows in Melbourne. Let's put that back up. Okay, 3,800 households, 35% earning outright, 44% are borrowing, 20% are renting, 95% in mortgage stress. Ooch, that's a lot, 1,600 households, 87% in rental stress, some stressed investors, and overall financial stress at 65%, one of the highest we've seen tonight. Households, 83% are houses. People ratio is high, so mostly families. The vacancy rate at 4.7%, somewhat lower than others. Gross investment yields on average 3.3%. Net investment yield is minus 0.9%. We're seeing this in Melbourne a lot with net negative investment yield. That's one reason why a lot of property investors are listing in Melbourne. Taxable income, 84,000. Census was 90,000. Disposal monthly around $5,700 with 38% or $2,184 going on the typical mortgage and 31% at $1,794 going on the typical rent. And looking at scenarios, I'm afraid that even the best case scenario, I can't see house prices going up in this area because of this high financial stress metric. The base case is a significant fall and the worst case is a catastrophic fall. So let's hope that we don't see that. Drew makes the point. Yes, there's data that the census is not actually going to release, or indeed the ABS are not going to release other information. The structure of the next census is being discussed at the moment, by the way. And why don't they want to release the information? Good question. Well, it could well be, of course, that the information isn't in line with what people want to see. I don't know. It should be objective, independent. It should be as comprehensive as possible, in my view. But we do seem to be cutting a few corners left, right, and centre. And as I posed earlier on, I do think there's a serious question. Will they be providing census forms to those people living in tent cities? Or will the requirement be that you actually have to have a house to get effectively a census? Okay, what else have we got? Cookie Boy says we need to find a Roy Morgan to compete with the ABS. Inflation is definitely not 2%. Yep, I agree. That's my point. All of the analysis that I've done, all my modeling says it looks as though we have a much higher inflation rate. But of course, if you actually take that on board, what that means is that the Reserve Bank's policy path for the last few years has been all over the place because they're targeting the wrong inflation rate. Pretty bad. Now, Dean asked for postcode 4560, which we can do. Thank you, Dean. 4560, I hope we can do. Yeah, no more Nambour. Let me bring that one back up. So this is in Brisbane and Moreton. 14,900 households, a third owning outright, 41% borrowing, quite high, 25% renting, mortgage stress of 51%, just over 3,000 households, 78% of renters in rental stress, just over 2,900 households, some stressed investors, overall financial stress 46%. Households, 79% are actually living in houses, and the people ratio is showing its families. The vacancy rate's 5.4%. Gross investment yields back to 4.4. So some of these areas around Brisbane have quite strong gross investment yields, but net investment yields are still negative. Average taxable 77,000 compared with 73,000 from the census gives a disposal monthly around $4,900, with 42%, just over $2,000 going on the typical mortgage, and 37%, 1,869 going on the typical rent. And from a scenario perspective, the best case still further rises. Well, 12% if you're lucky over 3 years. Base case, a small fall, just over 2% over 3 years. Or worst case, 22% down over 3 years. Just quite amused by Swart's comment here. Data doesn't lie, but statistics do, don't they, ABS? Yes. So, you wonder. It's all about assumptions. It's all about how accurate the data is, but also philosophically about what you're trying to achieve, I suppose. And, the reason I do my analysis and my surveys is I don't believe some of the official data tells the full story. Now, Dylan asked for postcode 4670, which we can do. Focus on Queensland tonight, which is fine. 4670, which is Bundaberg. Here, 35,000 households, 39% owning outright, 30% are borrowing, 29% are renting. 34% are in mortgage stress, 80% are in rental stress, and 23% are in investor stressed land. Overall financial stress, 42%. 83% are houses. People ratio is just over 2. Vacancy rate's 8.4. Gross investment yields, again, 4.4%. Net investment yield, 0.2%. So it is positive, just. Average taxable, 79,000 compared with 62,000 in the census, giving a disposal monthly of around $4,200 with 36.7%, 1,560 on the typical mortgage, and 33.4%, 1,420 going on the typical rent. Scenarios would suggest that the best case still further rises, maybe 13% over 3 years. The base case, a small fall, and the worst case, a significant fall, maybe 22% over 3 years. Drew asked for postcode 3000. Yes, worth looking at 3000. Bit of a story to tell there, of course. And here we've got 23,000 households, 12.3% owning outright, 11% borrowing, 75% are renting. Massive renting city. And whilst there are a small proportion in mortgage stress, 87% are in rental stress. That's more than 15,000 households. And you can see that the financial stress at 74% is pretty high. There's no houses there, so it's all units in that area. People ratio is much, much lower, of course. Obviously, many singles in that area. Very high vacancy rate as well. Remember, this was done when the census had a lot of closed property. Students were away. Maybe lower now, but we know that there's still very high vacancy even now in this area. 4.3% gross investment yield. Net investment yield minus 0.2. Also worth saying in terms of vacancies that quite a few of the properties here are held vacant deliberately by owners, not willing to let them out, just holding them for long-term growth. Average taxable, 82,000. The census said 67,000. That gives a disposal monthly of just over 5,000, with 40.9% going typical mortgage, just over 2,000, and 36%, 1,843 going on the typical rent. Looking at the scenarios ahead, well, if the best case scenario is true, maybe slight growth, 5% over 3 years. Base case, a small of a fall, 9%, small fall perhaps, but 7% over 24 months, 9.2% over 3 years, and the worst case, a fall of 30%. Clinton commented about put that back up there. Homelessness. Yeah, there's a lot of homelessness about. Again, this is amazing to me that this has gone out of the news. So all of the homelessness, walk down the streets and it's just now you see people living in doorways or living in tent cities, and not just in the major centres, but in regional areas. And, I used to live in Thirroul. We used to have our own homeless in Thirroul, remarkably. And it's become a feature. And I'm afraid that there is not enough political action here. So it is disastrous what we're seeing. Australia asks for 2261. Put that up. Yep. This is Batu Bay. Bring that on screen. So here we had 22,000 households with a third owning outright, 36% borrowing and 29% renting. We have stress mortgages, 29%, 85% in rental stress, again high, and overall financial stress, 42%. 73% of houses, 2.2% of the people ratio, gross investment yield 3.4, negative investment yield, net minus 1.1%. Average taxable 83,000 compared with 75,000 for the census, translates to a disposal monthly of just over $5,100 after tax, with 47%, $2,400 going on the typical mortgage, and 37.6% or $1,918 going on the typical rent. Scenarios are positive, 10% best case over 3 years, base case a small fall, worst case a significant fall over 3 years. NADA asked for 3806. Which is Berwick. Here we have 18,000 households, 28% owning outright, 49% borrowing, 22% renting, a lot of mortgage stress, a lot of rental stress as well, and overall financial stress, the highest I've seen at 71% today. 89% of houses. People ratios, family, 2.76, and the vacancy rate was 4.7%. Gross investment yield 3.5%, net investment yield minus 1.2%. Average taxable 103,000, household census 110. That translates to a disposal monthly of $6,900 with 34.7% or $2,400 going on a typical mortgage and 28.8%, $1,993 going on the typical rent. Scenarios are negative, pretty negative, and very negative in the three scenarios. 3.7% cumulative best case, 18% base case, 39% worst case. So this is a classic example where we are seeing those with slightly higher income actually under significant financial pressure. Nick asks for 4879, which is Palm Grove in the far north. In fact, I did Palm Grove the other day in my anti-spruik, so check that out too. 9,000 households, 29% owning outright, 39% borrowing and 30% renting, 36% in mortgage stress, 33% in rental stress, financial stress 26%, 78% of houses, so some other units and things there too. People ratios at just over 2. High vacancy rate, of course, a lot of second homes, Airbnb up in that area. Gross investment yield 4.1%, but the net investment yield is minus 0.9%. Average taxable 86,000 compared with 88,000 from the census. And I will just highlight that I quote these two because it's quite interesting seeing just how well correlated they often are. Remembering that the household census is at a household level, the individual ATO is at the individual level. Disposal monthly $6,200 with a third going on the typical mortgage, just over $2,000, and 32%, $1,993 going on the typical rent. And house prices could well rise higher, 20% over 3 years, maybe. Best case, 6%, base case, or a fall of 14%, worst case. Leon asked an interesting question there. Interesting suggestion. Can I do an episode on the top 20 vacant suburbs? Yes, I could do that. I can't pull that out now, but it's a query I could run. And if I do that, I could then actually do some analysis on it. So that could be quite interesting. Right, let me just look at the chat, see where we are. Let's go back and have a look. Come down. He says, any new guests on the cards? Yeah, struggling with that. I've got a couple of people that I'm trying to cajole to come on. I had somebody cancel on me at short notice, and somebody else who promised to come on then didn't come on, so I had to change the show literally on the fly. But I'm working on some other guests. I will say that next week Turner LeCantre is coming back, so he's an old favourite, but he's coming. So look at that. And what else have we got here? I think I did that one. Yes, I did. Okay. Seeing what else. Yeah, Cookie's asking when's Warren Hogan coming on. I have tried to get Warren on. I did try to interview him, and unfortunately we couldn't tee it up. Although, mind you, he's now changed his tune. He's saying we need bigger cuts, so we'll see. But he's somebody I'm still in touch with. So watch this space, Cookie. I can't promise it, but I need to. I can take people to water, but I can't make them drink necessarily. So that's just the way it is. Okay, just had this one come in 4883 from. See where that one is. I know quite a few postcodes off by heart, but I don't know all of them. Now 4883 is one that's not in my database. So that must be a small count, but I can't actually give you any data on it this month. What happens is that the very small counts sort of disappear. I've got more than 2,600 postcodes covered, but of course there are a few more than that. So unfortunately, I can't do that for you today. Apologies. Maybe another time. Australia makes the point that rental stress was highest in 2261 so far. Yeah, well, I went through the top ones there, of course, in rental stress earlier on in the show. If you didn't see that, go back and check it out. Right. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of the show. And of course, one of the pieces of the model I do is the scenarios. So the Australian house price scenarios at an aggregate level over the next 3 years. The best case is a rise of 12.9% over 3 years. The base case is a small easing, down 1.7%. And the worst case is a fall of 22.5%. Units, pretty close, following on quite closely as well, but not perhaps dropping quite as much. So that's the overall scenario for Australia at the moment. Now I saw there, Taz has just thrown me a couple of postcodes. Let's bring that one back up. 7011. So this is Berrydale in Tassie. And here we have 6,700 households with 28% earning outright, 37% borrowing and 33% are renting, 65% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress, overall financial stress at 56%, quite high. 79% of houses there. 2.26% is the people ratio, so that's families. 5.2% vacancy rate. Gross investment yield 4.9%. Net investment yield positive 0.1%. Average taxable 70,000 compared with 67,000 from the census. And that gives us a disposable monthly of 4,756 with 32.8% at 1,560 going on the typical mortgage and 33.5% at 1,595 going on the typical rent. Scenarios don't look particularly healthy. The best case scenario is going sideways. The base case, a fall of 14% cumulative over 3 years, and the worst case, a fall of 36% over 3 years. And you also asked about 710. Which is Rosetta. And here we've got 7,900 households, 28% earning outright, 30% borrowing, 41% renting, 71.4% in mortgage stress, 86% in rental stress, overall financial stress at 61.7%. 79.5% houses, people ratio is 2.23, gross investment yield 4.8, net investment yield is positive 0.8%. Taxable income 68,000 from the ATO, 63,000 from the census. That gives us a disposable monthly around $4,600, with a third going on typical mortgage 1,560, and 34%, 1,595, going on the typical rent. Interesting, the rent's just slightly higher there. Scenarios are again negative, down 3.8% cumulative over 3 years. Best case, base case, down 18%. Worst case, down 38.8%. So there you go. And as Cookie said, yes, noticing that the mainstream media continue to spruik Melbourne. They do. And, the data is not actually supporting their spruiking. But hey, there you go. Actually, Clinton made the point, media is turning into a sort of hedge fund as the media is dying out there, mining and real estate. Yeah, absolutely. They are strongly connected, of course. And, Channel 7 is into mining. Channel 9, of course, real estate there. And, of course, the media rags as well. So, and also the portal. So maybe not surprising. That's the problem, really. Objectivity is a problem. And one of the things that I find frustrating is that the story gets told, but partially told. And of course, there is a much, much more important story to tell. But unfortunately, that story is getting strangled. At least we try. We continue to try and tell the story. Anyway, I think that pretty much is the end of the show. So I want to say thank you for spending some time with us this evening. Just to tell you that Tony Locantro is coming on next week, if you'd like to join us for that. Of course, we play Locantro Bingo. But of course, Tony's been quite successful recently with some of his programs, particularly some of the small cap stuff. So we'll be touching that. As I close the show, I want to make 3 quick points, as I always do. There are lots of households with financial pressure. If you are in financial pressure, don't expect the RBA to get you out of jail. It's very important that you actually build a cash flow and understand where your money is coming in, going out, and then ask where you can sort of trim around the edges. Restructuring and refinancing doesn't necessarily help. It just postpones the inevitable quite often. The banks restructure to their own benefit, not necessarily to borrowers' benefit. And whilst the interest rates are coming down a little, the average mortgage repayments are still very high, as you saw from my modelling. So if you need help, particularly if you've got big debt, the National Debt Helpline is what I recommend referring to. National Debt Helpline here, 1-800-007-007, government-backed, of course, and the counsellors are extremely busy, but they are very capable at helping people with debt problems and debt solutions and complex situations. So they are a good one. Don't just Google debt help or debt counsellors on Google. You'll end up with places where you get charged for things you shouldn't get charged for. And the other interesting tool, which I always refer to, is the AFCA Statement of Financial Position. This is a tool that you can download, and here it allows you to identify your income, your borrowing details, living expenses. It's a cash flow measure, basically, and it's a form that you can then use to take to your financial counsellor or talk to your bank. It really helps. It's free, and I recommend it. So that's just a couple of really interesting suggestions as to where to get help. I also make the point, if you would like more information about the information that we have, we do provide that through our Patreon service. There are various levels, and thank you for all of those who do subscribe to support us via Patreon. It's really, really appreciated. It really helps to cover our costs. But specifically, the $50 a month plus GST tier gets you access to all 2,000 plus postcodes with all the information I've been sharing in the spreadsheets tonight. And we have quite a few people who have subscribed to that. And I'll be sending this out next week for July. And I send it out each month for you subscribed. So if you're interested in that, go grab a subscription via Patreon. I'll also make the point that we've got information about what we do on walktheworld.com.au, and particularly our tie-up with Nucleus Wealth and the Walk the World funds. So check that out. And also, of course, check out my DFA blog, where I actually continue to put all the information. And if for any reason I get chopped on YouTube, it'll be over on my blog because I run that soup to nuts. I don't now publish alerts from the blog, I should add, because I was getting people saying I was sending out too much stuff. So the blog is there. Go check it out if you'd like all the information. There's links to all of other stuff there. Or if you'd like to support me via PayPal, you can do that. Here's the link. And people do make one-off donations. Always appreciated. It really helps just to cover the cost. Or indeed, even Bitcoin is achievable. And that postcode, that QR code is there if you're interested in supporting me that way. It's really greatly appreciated. And just for those who are long-term subscribers, thank you for your support. For those who like and subscribe, thank you for doing that. Please like and subscribe. You know, it does make a huge difference to me. I continue to publish these posts on a regular basis and, of course, make daily posts on the various aspects of finance and property with a number of our guests. Check out the recent post I did with Tarek if you didn't see that, because that was a really hot one. And we've got more coming from Tarek, hopefully, down the track, as well as our other guests too. So there we go. That is it. Thank you very much indeed for spending some time with us this evening. The doggies are sort of here. I just need to position the camera differently to capture them because Meteor's spilling out. It's quite warm, so she's probably sort of enjoying the slightly cooling breeze from that particular situation. But she is there and obviously ready for her next walk, which is the next thing on my agenda for today. So I want to say thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Really have appreciated it. Thanks for bearing with us through the slight hiccups with the with the systems. It's quite complicated what I do here, and occasionally things go wrong, as you see, but at least we've managed to sort it all out. So have a good week. I hope that your finances are improving. Now, of course, before I go, we have to look at the poll. And so I'm just going to look at the poll. And firstly, I need to end the poll. And I can tell you then that we had the following. No impact at all to my finances, 41%. Will reduce my income via deposits, 28%. And a slight help to my finances, 26%, but only 4% saw that it was a major benefit to their finances. So it shows you where our audience is, at least with regard to this. And it is fascinating seeing that. So thank you for putting those answers in. And finally, Cookie, thank you very much for your comment there. I just want to call out Cookie Boy because he's been providing me with a lot of the clips and also a lot of the research, particularly with regards to the Andy Spruik. So Cookie, really appreciate your support. We do really appreciate what you do for us here on the channel too. Anyway, that's it. I'm done. Have a great week. We'll see you next week. And thanks for spending some time with us this evening. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care.